Okay, so get this. We're going deep on a guy who found meaning in, like, the worst possible place you can imagine, a Nazi concentration camp.
You're talking about Viktor Frankl, right?
Yeah, Viktor Frankl, Viennese psychiatrist, not only survived Auschwitz, but kind of revolutionized psychotherapy based on what he went through.
That's wild.
We've got a whole stack of his writings, plus some critical analyses to unpack. Think of this deep dive as like your cheat sheet to Frankl's wisdom.
What always gets me about Frankl's story is he doesn't just, tell us to find meaning. He chooses how. Powerful stories, real-life examples, the whole deal.
We're going to get into some intense stuff. A marble fragment that became a lifeline, this act of sharing bread that, like, speaks volumes about human resilience. Even finding beauty in a sunset when everything around you is just, well, horrific.
It's heavy stuff.
But this isn't just a history lesson, right? We're going to see how Frankl's insights can help you and me navigate our own tough times, find meaning in the everyday.
Even before the camps, Frankl was obsessed with the why behind what people do. Like, not just what they did, but what was driving them.
He was always searching for that deeper meaning, even as a young guy.
Right. And you can see the influence of Vienna's intellectual scene back then. Think Freud, psychoanalysis, all about diving into the complexities of the mind. Frankl, even as a young psychiatrist, was already using that kind of approach to help his patients find meaning in their suffering.
There's this Nietzsche quote that Frankl really seemed to take to heart. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. It's like it foreshadows his whole journey, right?
Yeah.
Not just surviving the camps, but turning that experience into something profound.
Totally. That quote became like a guiding principle for Frankl in his work and in his life. It speaks to the power of having a why, something to hold on to when you're facing huge obstacles.
Speaking of obstacles, things were getting really bad in Austria for Frankl and his family. Nazi occupation on the horizon, and he actually gets a visa to escape to the United States.
And here's where it gets really tough. Frankl had a chance to save himself, but it meant leaving his parents behind. Imagine having to make that choice, knowing what could happen to them.
Yeah, knowing what we know now about the Holocaust, the weight of that decision is just unimaginable. What factors did he have to consider?
Well, he was incredibly close to his parents. And at their age, they weren't exactly up for that kind of journey. Plus, Frankl had a deep sense of responsibility towards them. He had to balance that with his own desire to survive.
So not a simple decision at all. Personal and ethical considerations all mixed up.
Absolutely. And this is where the marble fragment story comes in. In the midst of all the chaos of the Nazi occupation, Frankl finds this tiny piece of marble from a destroyed synagogue. It had a Hebrew letter on it, part of the commandment to honor your father and your mother.
Whoa, talk about a sign at a crucial moment. Do you think that's what made him decide to stay?
Hard to say for sure, but it resonated with him deeply. Frankl was very connected to his Jewish faith, and this was like a tangible reminder of his values, a little beacon of meaning when the world felt like it was falling apart.
Yeah, I could see how that would play into his decision. So he chooses to stay, knowing the risks.
He does. And soon after, he and his family are deported to Theresienstadt, their first experience of a concentration camp.
What was life like in Theresienstadt? What were they thrown into?
Imagine being pulled from your home, crammed onto a train, no idea where you're going, the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being stripped of everything that makes you, you.
And then arriving at Theresienstadt, which the Nazis were trying to pass off as a model camp to fool the outside world.
Right, a total facade. But behind it all, it was still deprivation, hardship, constant threat, barbed wire, guard towers, hardly any food, crammed living spaces, the fear of disease, of death, always hanging over you.
Frankl writes about the psychological impact of all this on the prisoners. The struggle to hold on to hope, to find meaning when everything is so bleak. As a psychiatrist, what did he observe about how people were coping?
He noticed something interesting even in this horrible place. Some prisoners did better than others. He saw that those who clung to a sense of purpose, even a small one, were more resilient. They found ways to hold on to their humanity.
Like that spark of meaning, that why, helped protect them from the dehumanizing effect of the camp.
Exactly. And it wasn't always about, grand gestures or big ideas. Sometimes it was sharing a tiny bit of bread with someone, a kind word, finding a moment of beauty in a sunrise.
So even in this awful place, Frankl was seeing the power of meaning in action. And wasn't he working in a mental health unit in Theresienstadt, using his skills to help other prisoners?
He was. And that experience, seeing people in these extreme conditions, would deeply influence his later work. It's almost like the seeds of logotherapy, his approach to therapy, were planted right there in the camps.
It's amazing to think that amidst all this suffering, he was already developing ideas that would help so many people find meaning in their own lives. But Frankl's journey takes an even darker turn. He and his fellow prisoners are sent from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz.
And Auschwitz was on a whole other level of horror. This was a place designed for extermination, where the Nazis' true intentions were on full display.
Frankl describes arriving at Auschwitz, being separated from his wife, not knowing if he'd ever see her again. The forced labor, the constant hunger, the threat of the gas chambers, it's just heartbreaking.
It is. But even in Auschwitz, Frankl continues to observe, to search for meaning, to find those little glimmers of hope in the darkness.
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. How did Frankl hold on to his humanity, his sense of self, in a place meant to strip him of everything? How did Auschwitz shape his understanding of meaning and purpose? So we left off with Frankl at Auschwitz. And this wasn't just another concentration camp, was it?
No. Auschwitz was, well, it was a death factory, plain and simple. A horrifyingly efficient system for dehumanizing and exterminating anyone the Nazis deemed unworthy.
Frankl talks about being separated from his wife when they arrived, not knowing if he'd ever see her again. I mean, that alone on top of everything else must have been just crushing.
Absolutely. And we have to remember, Frankl wasn't just like observing all this from a distance. He was living it, you know? The same deprivations, the same psychological torture, the same constant threat of death.
It's hard to fathom how anyone could find even a shred of meaning in a place like that.
And yet he does. Frankl tells the story about a prisoner starving, barely clinging to life himself, and he shares his last piece of bread with someone weaker than him. Think about that for a second. When every instinct is telling you to hoard what little you have, this man chooses to give it away.
It's like the ultimate act of compassion in the face of absolute dehumanization. What would make someone do that? What gave him the strength to be so selfless in that moment?
That's the question Frankl wrestled with. And he came to the conclusion that even in Auschwitz, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, humans still have the ability to choose how they respond. That prisoner, by sharing his bread, found a purpose, a reason to believe in something bigger than himself.
So it's not about pretending the suffering isn't real. It's about finding those moments, those choices that reaffirm our humanity, even in the darkest of places.
Exactly. And Frankl found meaning in some pretty unexpected places, too. He describes looking up one day and seeing this incredible sunset right there in Auschwitz. That unexpected beauty, that connection with nature, gave him a sense of peace, a flicker of hope.
It reminds you that even in the bleakest environment, beauty can still exist. And maybe even more importantly, that we can still appreciate it, find comfort in it.
Right. And these experiences, these observations, they became the foundation for Frankl's most important work, logotherapy.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. We've talked about Frankl's search for meaning, but how did that turn into an actual therapeutic approach?
Well, at its core, logotherapy is the idea that what drives us as humans isn't pleasure, like Freud believed, but the search for meaning. Frankl argued that we all have this deep need to find purpose and significance in our lives.
And he saw this play out in the camps firsthand. The prisoners who had something to hold on to, a reason to keep going, were more likely to survive.
Exactly. And what's key here is that logotherapy doesn't dictate what your meaning should be.
Yeah.
It helps you uncover the meaning that's already within you.
So it's about recognizing your own values, beliefs, experiences as the source of your purpose, not some external set of rules or expectations.
Exactly. Frankl believed each of us has this will to meaning, a drive to find what gives our lives purpose. And logotherapy provides the tools to help people discover and connect with that meaning.
And Frankl wasn't just, theorizing about this stuff. He wasn't some ivory tower academic detached from reality. He lived through it. His whole journey, from his work before the war to the horrors of the camps, it all shaped his understanding of logotherapy.
Absolutely, and that's what makes his work so powerful, so authentic. He wasn't just talking about meaning, he was living it, demonstrating its power even in the most awful circumstances.
But Frankl's story doesn't end at Auschwitz. He's eventually liberated, though it comes at a terrible price.
Right, Frankl was freed from Turkheim, a subcamp of Dachau, in April 1945. But the freedom was bittersweet. He soon learned that his wife, his parents, his brother, they hadn't survived.
To go through so much and then face that kind of loss, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. Did he ever question his beliefs, his faith in meaning after all that?
That's something a lot of people wonder about. And while we can't know for sure what was going on in Frankl's heart, his actions tell us a lot. He didn't give in to despair. He chose to find meaning in his grief, in honoring his loved ones by helping others find their own meaning.
So even in his darkest moment, he still held on to that belief that meaning is what gives us the strength to go on, to keep moving forward.
Exactly, and this is where we see logotherapy really take off. He rewrote Man's Search for Meaning, which he actually drafted right after he was liberated. It became a worldwide phenomenon. Millions of copies sold, translated into tons of languages.
This book, born out of unimaginable suffering, offering a message of hope and resilience that still resonates with people today. What do you think it is about Frankl's story, his approach, that people are still so drawn to?
I think it's his honesty. He's not preaching from some distant, intellectual place. He's speaking from experience, from having looked into the abyss and found a way back. And he's not offering easy answers or oversimplifications. He recognizes how complex human suffering is, but he also insists on our ability to find meaning, even in the toughest situations.
And logotherapy isn't just about surviving trauma, right? It's about finding meaning in everyday life, in our relationships, our work, the things we're passionate about. It's about that universal desire to feel like our lives matter, like we're contributing to something bigger.
Exactly. Frankl talked about this thing he called the existential vacuum, this feeling of emptiness, lack of direction that people experience when they haven't found meaning in their lives. He believed this existential vacuum is at the root of a lot of psychological problems, leading to boredom, apathy, even despair.
So logotherapy isn't just for people who've been through something extreme. It's for anyone who's ever felt lost, uncertain, or questioning their purpose.
Exactly. And it gives you a framework for actively searching for that meaning. It's not about waiting for some, big revelation or someone to tell you what your purpose is. It's about making choices, engaging with the world, and living a life that feels authentic and purposeful.
It's kind of empowering, isn't it?
Mm.
The idea that we're not just helpless victims of circumstance, but that we have a role in creating meaning in our own lives.
Absolutely. And Frankl offered some practical techniques for doing that. Things like dear reflection, where you shift your focus away from yourself and onto something larger. Or paradoxical intention, where you face your fears head on by actually trying to make them happen.
These are tools anyone can use, no matter their background or the challenges they're dealing with.
Right. That's the beauty of logotherapy. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's a framework that can be adapted to individual needs and situations.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about Frankl's idea that it's not about asking what the meaning of life is, but recognizing that it's life that's asking that question of us.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? It puts the responsibility on us as individuals to answer life's call for meaning in our own unique ways.
So there's no single right answer. It's about each of us finding our own why, our own reason for being, and living a life that reflects that.
Exactly. And that journey, that search for meaning, is what makes life worth living, It gives us the strength to face challenges, overcome obstacles, and create a life that feels fulfilling and significant.
Frankl's story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can not only survive, but actually thrive. It's a call to action for all of us to find our own meaning, to live with purpose, and to make the world a little bit better than we found it. It's hard to move on, without acknowledging that Frankl gets out of the camps only to face the fact that his whole family, his wife, his parents, his brother, they're all gone.
It's just unimaginable, right? To survive all that and then be hit with that level of loss.
It makes you wonder if he ever, questioned his beliefs, his whole thing about meaning, after facing such a tragedy.
It's a question a lot of people ask, and while we can't know for sure what was going on inside, I think his actions say a lot. He didn't just, crumble under the weight of it all. He chose to find meaning in that grief, in honoring his loved ones by dedicating himself to helping others find their own meaning.
So even then, at his lowest point, he still held on to that idea that meaning is what gives us the strength to keep going.
Exactly. And that's where we see logotherapy really start to take shape. He rewrote Man's Search for Meaning, which he'd actually drafted right after liberation. And it just exploded, became this global phenomenon, millions of copies, translations into I don't know how many languages.
It's a book born out of such darkness, but it offers this message of hope that people all over the world connected with. Why do you think that is? What is it about Frankl's story, his whole approach, that still speaks to people today?
I think it's because he's so real, so genuine. He's not talking down to you from some, academic ivory tower. He's speaking from experience, from having faced the worst of humanity and finding his way back. And he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He acknowledges how complicated human suffering is. But he also insists that we're capable of finding meaning, even when things are incredibly tough.
And logotherapy isn't just about surviving trauma, right?
No, not at all.
It's about finding meaning in the everyday, in relationships, in work, in the things we're passionate about.
It's about that need we all have to feel like our lives matter, like we're part of something bigger.
Exactly.
Frankl called this the existential vacuum, that feeling of emptiness, like you're adrift, when you haven't found that sense of meaning.
So it's not just for people who've been through something extreme.
Right, it's for anyone who's ever felt lost or unsure about their purpose.
And it gives you a way to actively search for that meaning, rather than just waiting for it to magically appear.
Exactly. It's about making choices, engaging with the world, and creating a life that feels authentic.
It's kind of empowering, isn't it? The idea that we have a say in creating meaning in our own lives.
It is, and Frankl gave some really practical tools for doing that, like de-reflection, where you shift your focus outward,
Wow.
or paradoxical intention, where you kind of lean into your fears.
Stuff anyone can try, no matter what they're going through.
That's what's so great about logotherapy. It's flexible, it can be adapted to any situation.
I keep coming back to that idea of Frankl's that it's not about us asking what the meaning of life is. It's about recognizing that life is asking that question of us.
It really flips the script, doesn't it?
It makes it our responsibility to find those answers in our own way.
Yeah, there's no one right answer. It's about each of us figuring out our own why, our own purpose, and living a life that reflects that.
Frankl's story shows us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can not only survive, but thrive. It's a challenge to all of us to find our own meaning, to live with purpose, and to make the world a little better.